Eldred said, I think today is sort of a first step to better explaining what the benefits of solar are, as well as what good solar policy looks like. It is a very complicated topic, and the utilities and those who are opposed to solar have the advantage of not really needing to tell the truth when they want to get their point across. But here in the solar industry, we're really trying to give you the facts, and the facts aren't always black and white. Sometimes there are shades of gray. So it's important to spend some time on this issue and listen if you really want to ensure that solar can still work for Massachusetts moving forward. You hear a lot about solar being inaccessible to low-income people. You hear a lot about poor people paying for rich people's panels. Well, I'm here to tell you, as an employee of a solar company that works in low-income communities, that's not the case. Solar is working for low-income communities today in Massachusetts. Before you have a picture of one of our most recent projects. It's the Oscar Romero House in New Bedford. It's a project that's owned by the Community Action for Better Housing. They pay the electricity bills for the 12 units for that, so the rent can stay affordable for low-income people that are living in the building. But if you look at that building, the roof doesn't look great for solar, does it? Because there's all these little peaks in there, and there's a chimney in the back that you can't quite see, and that shades the roof. So the roof isn't great for solar. So they came to Boston Community Capital, and they were interested in going solar. And we said, well, perfect timing. We have an off-site solar project that we're developing, and we'd love if you became one of our subscribers. And they did. So they're a member of our solar project that we're currently building right now in Onset, Massachusetts. And as a member of our solar farm, we're actually fixing and lowering the cost of their electricity bills. So last winter, their electricity bill jumped 28%, as did most everyone else's in this room. But instead, this winter, their prices are actually going to be stable, and we're going to save them an estimated $1,200 a year. Solar is also working for cities and towns. We have solar in 350 of the 351 cities and towns in Massachusetts. Over half of the cities and towns in Massachusetts actually own or benefit directly from a solar project. We have one example up in front of you right here in Lexington, Massachusetts. It's a 1.1 megawatt solar project across 6 different roofs. It's going to save the city over $5.6 million over the next 25 years, stabilizing their electricity costs, delivering health benefits to everyone locally in the amount of $800,000, and covering about 15% of municipal electricity demand. And community shared solar. You've heard a little bit about community shared solar already. Community shared solar is a way that everybody in this room or anybody in Massachusetts can directly access solar. It doesn't matter if you are low income. It doesn't matter if you're a renter. It doesn't matter if you have an old roof. It doesn't matter if your roof faces the wrong direction. Community shared solar is a way for you to directly invest in your community and to directly invest and benefit from solar. We have a project in Pioneer Valley in Massachusetts, 300 kilowatt project that's under development. The local residents, the great thing about this model is that the local residents will receive all of the tax benefits. So none of the money associated with this project is leaving Massachusetts, except for the money to buy the equipment. Everything else is staying in Massachusetts. So it is through and through a local investment in Massachusetts. And the participants are estimated to save about $600,000 in total over on their electricity bills over the next 20 years. I'm going to turn it over to Larry now to talk a little bit more about the benefits that everyone receives from solar, regardless of whether you're participating in community shared solar or have panels on your roof.
To do that in a complete way. And there are a number of benefits that solar provides that we really need to understand in order to be providing fair payment for solar so that we get the most cost-effective investment in solar. This slide shows a number of the benefits and the costs that come with doing solar. And there are several benefits that aren't immediately apparent or that you might not think of when you think of solar. It is not just producing power. It is producing power locally. It's like the difference between going to the store and being able to buy broccoli or apples or whatever it is that you want to get versus having to go out to California and buy it from the farmer. Okay? Solar delivers power locally. And that provides a number of economic and financial benefits. For one, it reduces the amount of transmission infrastructure that we have to invest in. You don't need as many long-distance transmission lines when the power is being produced locally. The farming analogy is you don't need as many trucks to bring the stuff in from the farms. That's a cost benefit. And that should be fairly included in the accounting for how we think about the benefits of solar. The utilities will never talk about this because they make money from transmission. It's one of their primary sources of profit. And solar puts that business and that profit at risk. There's other benefits as well. Solar reduces the demand for centrally generated power. When you reduce the demand for centrally generated power, you reduce its price. That's a benefit that everyone here gets, whether you have solar on your roof or not. So everyone here is getting the benefit of solar reducing the demand for centrally generated power because it reduces the price for everyone. Those are just a couple of the benefits. And we need to be making sure that we're thinking about the full and complete picture of benefits and costs as we think about the future of solar. That hasn't been done in the past, and we need to be doing that. What we've found on the task force is that when you look at that balance of benefits and costs, as Emily mentioned, you're getting $2.2 to $2.7 for every dollar of investment. That's a really good investment. And furthermore, to the equity and accessibility themes that we've mentioned, it needs to be available to everyone. I built the community solar business at Next Step Living because we were doing a rooftop solar. And we rated tens of thousands of roofs in Massachusetts. And 8 in 10 people, that's everyone here, from here on, you can't put solar on your roof because you don't have a good roof for solar. What are you going to do? Community solar allows you to have access. But it is fundamentally at risk in many of the proposals that have been put forth in the House. And so we need to think about how to fairly pay for it so that we have a fully balanced and fair economy for this going forward. Just very quickly, as a primer on how solar works, it earns money in 2 ways. It gets paid for 2 things. There's a net metering credit, and then there's an incentive, often called an SREC, a solar renewable energy credit. Okay? Net metering is payment for the electric production that solar provides, that local power that I was just describing. It is not a subsidy. It is not an incentive. It is fair payment for services provided, or at least it is trying to be that. And we have worked initially in the lack of information about how the market functions 5 to 7 years ago to set up some pretty effective signals. And the question is now, where do we go from there now that we have more information and solar has developed to the point that it has? But the fundamental point to remember, there's going to be 2 things I ask you to remember today. This is one of them. Net metering, not a subsidy, not an incentive. It is compensation for what solar is producing. SRECs, the Solar Incentive Program, that's the incentive. And that's there to try and capture and pay for the societal benefits and the environmental benefits, the clean air benefits that our economic system is not very capable at pricing today. There's a lot of economic externalities, they're called, in our power system. Power producers can pollute the air, and they don't really have to pay all those costs. So the policymakers in Massachusetts have done a very good and hard set of work to try and fairly capture the benefits of having clean power versus dirty power. And that's what the incentive program tries to do. So these 2 things are where solar earns its money. And you're going to see them play through the structure of incentives and other components of policy that we talk about as we talk about what's been going on in the various bills in the session over the last few months. But please keep this framework in mind. Net metering, not an incentive. It's fair compensation. And then there's the incentive program through SRECs. So, what are we paying for solar? This is a really important question because it gets to many components of how we think about setting up the policy going forward. You've heard a lot of claims from many parties, the governor included, that solar is being paid on the order of 43 cents a kilowatt hour, 43 cents per unit of electricity right now, versus much less for what you normally pay on your bill. That is an inaccurate representation of what is going on. The chart shows what we're actually paying for solar versus the value of solar. So the first two bars on the chart, the small blue one and the one that has blue and red on it, that is what is being paid for solar in 2 different situations. The first bar is where it's just behind the meter. It's all being used on site. And it's only being paid the incentive, the SREC incentive for being clean power. The middle bar is what solar is being paid when it's a community solar project or a low-income solar project for a house that doesn't have a good roof for it. It's earning the SREC, and it's earning that red, which is the retail rate credit. The Acadia Center has done a study of what the value and benefits of solar are for Massachusetts, and that's shown in the final bar on the end. You can see it's higher than what solar is being paid. And the question may come, what's the difference between the 43 cents that the governor is talking about and what we're showing here, what I'm trying to describe to you here? It's a question of timing, and this is pretty complex. What the governor is doing is he's taking SREC numbers, which are paid over just a few years. SREC incentives are paid over a few years. And he's just saying, OK, we're paying that now. So that's what it costs. But really, SRECs are an incentive to provide motivation to have a 25 to 30-year solar project built. It's like your car. It's going to last for 25 or 30 years. So when you actually do the math the way that it should be done, and you think about what are you paying in order to have something that lasts 25 to 30 years, these are the numbers. It's not what you happen to be paying right now. It's what are you paying over time to acquire something that's going to last for 25 to 30 years. And that's complex, and it's one of the reasons that it works really well to do it the other way, is because it's easy to misunderstand. But if you think about it the way a business thinks about it, which is depreciation and life of the asset and all those sorts of things, this is what solar is being paid. And it's being paid pretty close to what it's generating in terms of value, a little bit less as best we can tell. So that's a really important thing to remember, because other parties in this have a motivation to only talk about cost. And they have a motivation not to show you the story that looks like this, that considers benefits, because their profits are at risk. So we've got solar policy reform on the table, and there's 175 communities across Massachusetts that can't take advantage of community solar or low-income solar or municipal solar right now, because the net metering caps are preventing any solar from moving forward in national grid territory and Unitil territory. As Mark mentioned, there's over $400 million of projects on hold. That's a lot of solar. And it's a lot of benefit for people in the community who are just trying to save a bit on their electric bill and trying to do something that allows them to save money while living in a way that aligns with what they believe. There's a lot of legislation that's been going around over the last few months and really few weeks on this, and we'll talk about that here in a moment. And many of the components of that legislation have incredibly strong impacts on low-income solar, municipal solar, and community solar for everyone here who doesn't have a good roof for solar. Everyone over here, you're great. You can do rooftop. You won the rooftop lottery. But everyone from here over, you need community solar. So just to give you a little bit of framing of how this is going to go, there's several bills that have come out over the last few months. And these are arranged chronologically. There was the Downey Amendment at the end of July. There was the governor's bill that came out a couple weeks later. There was the November House bill that came out in just a day or two before the Thanksgiving recess. And then there was a Senate bill that came out the last day before the Thanksgiving recess in response to the House bill. And they have different components that they all include. There's net metering caps. There's the net metering credit value. There's the solar incentive program, minimum bill, and grandfathering. And we're only going to focus on a few of these today because they're some of the ones that first are the most different between these different bills and have the biggest impact for the solar industry as well in terms of those differences. So we want to focus on the differences so you can understand what's going on there. And we'll get into that. Just as a brief note, you and people who have been coming to speak to you, for those of you that are legislators and legislative staff, a lot of what you've heard from people who are trying to support solar and believe in solar over the last several months is please raise the caps. And that's because caps have been limiting the ability to do any solar. And people have just been trying to get that out of the way so that the businesses can function and people can make investments. And what's happened is that all these other components of solar policy have been added to the process. So it's not just caps anymore. And we need to be thinking in a complete and effective way about how to set this up fairly so that the market can function completely and with good information. So first, net metering caps. Downey Amendment lists the caps, 1,600 megawatts, and then eliminates the caps after that. The other bills have a 2% cap increase. And for those of you that aren't deep in the weeds on this, the percentages are, they're an artifact of how the law is written. Essentially, a 2% number is used to determine a certain amount of megawatts space in the cap. It's based on a percentage of utility peak load. So that's why it's a 2% number. It's just the way the law was written originally. But essentially what it means is a certain amount of megawatt increase. And we'll get into that in a moment. So for low-income, community solar, and municipal solar, a 2% increase is only enough for a few months at best because there is a very long waiting list of projects that have been stacking up over the last several months, hoping that there would be action at some point by the legislature and that solar could continue. So that waiting list is large enough to take up most of a 2% increase. So a 2% increase would not allow the market to really continue. It would just allow most of what people have been trying to prepare last year to actually happen. So if the goal is to allow solar to continue to function as a market, more than 2% is needed. The net metering credit value. This is a really, really important one, as we were talking about the values before. Small solar is set up to receive retail rate. Small solar is essentially rooftop solar. So once again, everyone over here, you're great. Everyone over here, you have to pay attention to the rest of this. And there's a number of different categories of net metering credit framework that have been proposed. Don't really try and understand what all these different terms mean on this slide. We have a chart on the next slide that will show you what they mean. Just take away from this that there are many different structures among these different bills, okay? And what are those different structures? The chart here with the blue bars shows what they are. The July bill from the Senate had a relatively similar net metering credit rate to what we have today, which is retail. The Senate bill in November, somewhat lower. The Baker bill was even lower. And the House bill is the lowest of all. If you pay solar projects what the House bill is proposing to pay, the vast majority of solar projects in Massachusetts will not work. Investors will look at the expected rate of return. It will not be high enough for them to feel like that is a good use of their capital. They will take that capital to New York. They will take that capital to California and North Carolina and the other places where this is happening. This is not something where it's about how much solar developers are making in money. This is about allowing the investors that are bringing the money to make this possible to meet their threshold rate of return. That is the business of it. A wholesale credit rate, which is what the House is proposing, will not enable that. In Nevada, they just passed, about 2 or 3 weeks ago, wholesale credit rates. Since that time, middle of November, thousands of solar jobs have been lost in Nevada because the businesses that have been working to provide solar to the residents of Nevada looked at the numbers, they could not make the numbers work, and they knew that so clearly that as soon as the decision came out, they had to let their teams go. Solar City is firing 550 people in Nevada because of wholesale. If Massachusetts moves solar policy back to what is proposed in the House bill, that pushes the solar policy structure in Massachusetts back to where it was before the Global Warming Solutions Act in 2008. There's been a lot of really good work, a lot of really hard work over the last 7 to 8 years. And that would roll it all back. And there would be very little, if any, solar for community solar, for low-income solar, for municipal solar in Massachusetts.
I think the net metering credit value is sort of central to the current debate on solar in Massachusetts. The utilities want significant cuts in net metering credit values. The governor wants significant cuts in net metering credit values. At the same time, they're saying that we need to ensure that solar policy is more fair and that everyone can benefit from solar. Well, the problem is if you cut net metering credit rates for community shared solar, low-income solar, and municipal solar, only people with residences that have sunny rooftops can access solar. So you're actually making the equity and access problem worse. So if you want a policy that lowers costs to ratepayers at the same time that it increases access, it's not about cutting the net metering credit rate. It's about lowering the incentive level. And I'll go into that a little bit more in the next slide, but let's return to the first 3 projects that I talked about at the beginning of this presentation to really drive home the point that the bills that were voted on last year and that the governor's bill, what they would actually mean for the projects that we're building today in Massachusetts. The first project is the Oscar Romero House, a low-income project. Right now, Boston Community Capital is able to offer savings of about $1,200 a year to the community action building organization that's running it. Under the governor's bill, the savings would be reduced to at least $500. Under the House bill, they'd have to pay us $2,500 a year for solar. Do you think they're going to do that? No, they're not going to do that. And I think it's important to realize that for this particular project, the Oscar Romero House, that Boston Community Capital had access to an additional low-income tax credit, which helped to further lower the cost of the project. Without that tax credit, under the governor's bill, they'd have to pay us money as well. So that project wouldn't move forward. From the Boston Community Capital perspective, if we're going to low-income communities and saying, hey, you want to give us $2,500 to go solar, that's obviously a deal that doesn't work. It doesn't work for them. It doesn't work for most people. So that project's dead. For the municipal project, the current savings that Lexington is realizing on an annual basis over those 6 rooftops is $7,300 a year. Under the governor's bill, sorry, $73,000, thank you. Under the governor's bill, they would have to pay $31,000 extra in costs for that. Under the House bill, it gets even better. They would have to pay an additional $116,000 a year. So that project's dead, and it doesn't move forward. And finally, for community shared solar, under current savings, it's under the current policy, it's $30,000 a year that all of the members in total would save on their electricity bill. Under the governor's bill, maybe about $5,900 a year amongst all the members. Under the House bill, they would have to pay over $25,000 a year to go solar. And I think the key, another important point for everyone to realize here is this note at the bottom. This assumes our current SREC 2 incentives, which will not be available next year. And that's why in each of the bills that have been introduced, there's some sort of post-1600 megawatt solar program. But nobody knows what those incentive levels will be, except that they will be lower. They could be somewhere between current REC prices and current SREC prices. It's anybody's guess. But to do a fair analysis for this particular presentation, we assumed current policy on the incentive level. So really, if you maybe guess at what the incentive level would be, it's fair to say that under the governor's bill, the House bill that was voted on in November, and the Senate bill that was voted on in November, no low-income municipal solar or community shared solar project would be economic and would move forward. And you will have wiped out that entire sector. I'm pretty sure that nobody wanted to do that when they voted for those bills or even realized that that's what they were doing, but that's what each one of those bills does, which is why it's critically important to really understand what we're voting on when we're talking about solar policy, what good solar policy looks like, and if you want to lower costs, how best to do it. just spending a bit more time on wholesale issue, because we heard a lot in November that, well, wholesale is what natural gas generators get, so why shouldn't solar get paid that? That's not actually what wholesale generators get. So if you cut incentive payments down to wholesale for solar, not only will you have a Nevada on your hands, but you'll actually be paying solar less than you pay natural gas generators, coal-fired power plants, and nuclear power plants. It gets into all sorts of complicated details about how the wholesale market works, which I will spare you. If anybody really wants to understand that, we can have another legislative briefing. But it's important to realize that natural gas generators and the large wholesale generators that are, Pilgrim or Vermont Yankee, which we're luckily saying goodbye to, and Brayton Point and others, those get paid much more than the wholesale rate. So you actually would be paying those solar projects less. And as Larry has already mentioned, there's plenty of studies that show, and particularly here in Massachusetts, that the value of solar is actually higher than wholesale, and in many instances higher than retail. And the other thing we heard in November was, well, it's all right, we're just going to cut net metering rates and we can offset it with higher incentives. That doesn't work. Why? Well, there's a lot of reasons why. First of all, it's important to realize, again, coming back to one of the beginning slides that Larry covered, net metering credits are credits. They're not cash. They show up on your bill. If you're putting more electricity into the grid every month than you're consuming, at the end of the month you have a credit on your bill. You can roll that credit forward to next month's electricity bill, or you can share it with your neighbors. A lot of people actually do that. They do share it. They'll put solar on their rooftop, and they enter into an agreement with their neighbor either to share the credit or sell it, or some people even donate to their local church or synagogue. It's a great thing about net metering. It's a credit. It's not taxable. What is taxable are SRECs. Incentives are cash payments. Those are taxable, and that creates a lot of problems for a lot of different people, including low-income people, and nonprofits and other non-taxable entities. At the same time, dramatically lowering a net metering credit rate to, say, wholesale, when you're paying maybe 18 cents for your electricity and the net metering credit rate is 4 cents, it makes it really hard to try to save somebody money and balance their electricity bill out when there's such a disparity between what the solar electricity is being paid on a credit basis and what your electricity bill is at your particular house. The other important point to remember, especially for low-income communities, is that most new affordable housing developments cannot take cash payments. So if you're giving BCC a giant pile of cash for our next round of solar projects, I can't turn around and go to wind development or a local affordable housing development and say, here, let me give you some of that cash. They're actually restricted by law due to federal tax credit laws in what kind of cash they can receive. And if it's non-rental income, they can't take it. That's why in a lot of those places, they don't own the washing machines because they can't take the quarters. They will hire a third party to come in that owns the washing machines, they rent out that space, and that third party collects those quarters because the person or the company owning that affordable housing development cannot take that cash because it's non-rental income. So it's very important to remember that point. They can't take cash. So if you want to help low-income solar, you got to preserve the net metering credit rate. You can cut the incentive, that's fine, because that's cash. They can't take that, but they cannot take a large cash payment. The other important point is, if you're looking to save ratepayers money, cutting net metering credit incentives and trying to offset that on the incentive side doesn't save them any money, especially if you're trying to equal things out. You would have to increase incentives by more than $1 for every cut in net metering to equal out the cut, because the dollar incentive is taxable, the dollar credit is not. So you're not saving ratepayers any money with that approach. So it's important to realize that ratepayers pay for both the SRECs and the net metering credit. Utilities want you to cut the net metering credit because that undermines their profit motive and the ability to make money. They don't really care about the incentives. But really, from a policy approach to maintain access to solar, to ensure that the market is viable and vibrant, maintain current net metering rates to the extent possible, address cost issues on the incentive side. The next quick little policy piece we want to talk about is on the minimum bill. This has been around for a couple years now at the State House, but was only actually one piece of legislation last year, and that was the House bill. The House bill is really doing a good job going after solar, if you haven't gotten that message just yet. You might think that residential solar was safe in the House bill because current policy was preserved, but the minimum bill holds the possibility to completely undermine that market, both for new projects and existing projects. Why? Particularly because of the language fixed costs that was in the legislation. You might have read that, might not have meant anything to you, probably doesn't mean anything to most people, but that's special utility language. That means is trying to hold ratepayers, whether you have solar on your roof or not, accountable for the fixed cost, the wires that the utility has to put in the ground to just connect you to the grid. And they've asserted in DPU dockets time and time again that for every residential customer, regardless of whether there's solar on their rooftop or not, that those fixed costs are at least $30 a month. So extrapolating that out, you could expect a minimum bill of at least $360 a month for residential customers. Sorry. I'm also underslept, but I don't have a child, so I have no excuse. So $360 a year, which for most solar customers, doesn't make sense. We've got a great example in this room. Our friend John back here has solar on his roof. He went solar in 2007. Before he went solar, his electricity bill was $30 a month because he's energy efficient, he doesn't watch TV, he's very exciting otherwise, I promise, no. But John paid $30 a month, and he went solar in 2007, spent $20,000 of his own money to put panels on his roof, basically prepaid his electricity bill for the next 13 years, so now his electricity bill is $0. If you tack on now a $30 a month electricity bill, he's worse off with solar. It means he will never pay off that system, and he's paying basically about the same amount of money he was paying before he went solar. So it's, again, important to really think through the consequences of the policy decisions and the impact. Why do the utilities want minimum bills? Because it's certainty in their revenue, because they don't have to worry about how many kilowatt hours you're using to figure out how much money they're going to make. They like certainty, and they're asking for similar minimum bills or fixed charges or access fees all over the country. They also like minimum bills because it makes it harder to go solar, and they don't like solar unless they can own it. So it's important to think through not just the one side of the argument that you've heard that solar isn't covering its fair cost to the grid. First of all, there's no evidence of that. In other states where they've done those studies, the contrary has been shown to be true. And really understand what these kinds of provisions would mean. They might sound pretty straightforward. Fixed costs might sound innocuous. But again, a provision like this could then also wipe out the residential solar sector. And then what are we left with? More natural gas? More pipelines? Okay. So now that we've sort of thrown all of that at you, how in God's name do we craft good solar policy in Massachusetts? How do we lower costs while maintaining solar's benefits? Excellent question. As we've made very clear here throughout the presentation, you need to consider, first and foremost, costs as well as benefits. When we're looking to build a new natural gas pipeline or a transmission line, are people just looking at the cost of those things and saying, oh, God, that's going to be $7 billion? Because if they were, nobody's going to spend $7 billion. They look at both. The utilities say, yes, it's $7 billion. Yes, I want you to pay for it, but look what it's going to do for you. Well, we need to do the same thing for solar. And as I think we've shown quite well in this presentation, of course there's a cost to solar, there's a cost to any energy investment, but look at the benefits we're getting. We're getting more than twice the amount in benefits in return. We're getting jobs, we're getting clean air, we're meeting our Global Warming Solutions Act targets, we're building healthier, more resilient communities, we're protecting low-income communities from volatile and rising energy prices, we're making it easier to do business here in Massachusetts because we're stabilizing energy costs, and on and on and on. So it's critical to consider both sides of the equation when deciding how best to strike the balance between costs and benefits. The other important thing is I think we've already illustrated with the projects that we highlighted in this presentation is do not arbitrarily cut net metering credits. If you don't really understand what the cost of doing solar in Massachusetts is and you're voting for a bill that's going to slash rates by 75%, you're going to make it impossible to do all sorts of projects in Massachusetts when you probably didn't mean to make that happen. So really, if the legislature needs more information, ask for it. If you don't really understand the impact of something, don't rush to action. There's plenty of information out there about the value of solar in Massachusetts and elsewhere, and to the extent we don't have that information, we can make that happen. There are plenty of consultants in this state, as I'm sure you're aware, that can do the analysis and collect the data. And don't take the utilities at their word. Just as they love to argue that the solar industry is a business working to protect its own interest, the same is true for the utility. So if you're going to take the utility at their word, but not the solar industry, it's a little lopsided. So really, you guys are the objective arbiters here, not anyone else. And so it's your job to be fully informed and truly understand the decisions you're making and not to make arbitrary and hasty cuts just based on political pressure and political expediency. And last but not least, our third sort of item on the list would be just to eliminate net metering caps. If you haven't been here since 2008, you might not know that the solar industry has had to come up to the State House 4 times since 2008 to ask the legislature to raise net metering caps. I know you guys are really tired of hearing from us, and I apologize, but we can't build our projects as long as the caps are in place. So if you want us to leave you alone and you want to work on other issues, and I know there's plenty of other issues, a really good policy approach is to find a solution that allows solar to no longer be capped. There's lots of different options on the table to do so, keep solar moving forward, lower costs, lower risk to ratepayers, but give solar the sort of runway it needs. You know, a 2% cap that buys us 3 to 6 months, that doesn't a sustainable business market make. So really, let's have a thought about what's sustainable long-term policy in Massachusetts in light of our Global Warming Solutions Act goals, in light of the fact that we need to build megawatts upon megawatts upon megawatts of generation because all the power plants are retiring. We need to invest in our local energy economy. What's the best way to do it? I would wager that solar is one of the best ways to do it.